You may be asking yourself, Self, who is this wonderful man right here? Well, I'll tell you. His name is Dr. Kevin Kumashiro. Dr. Kumashiro is an educator who presses equality for minorities such as LGBTQ and ethnic students. He believes the role of the teacher is to empower students and be an anti-oppressive educator. Mr. Kumashiro earned his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and from there he began to do incredible things. He is a founding director of the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education. He was also a professor of Asian American Studies of Education at the University of Illinois in Chicago. There he was chair of Educational Policy Studies, interim co-director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, and coordinator of Asian American Studies. Currently, he has been serving as the Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco, and he is president of the National Association for Multicultural Education, otherwise known as NAME. If that isn't enough for you, he is also the founding member of the Chicagoland Researchers and Advocates for Transformative Education, or CREATE. Dr. Kumashiro's biggest influences were his mother, who was also a teacher that instilled her love of teaching to him, and some of his high school teachers that he really looked up to. Through his influences, his research, teaching, and activism are redefining the field of anti-oppressive education as he develops new approaches to addressing issues of social justice in schools.
Kumashiro's first teaching experience as a college graduate was in Nepal. In his book, Against Common Sense, Kumashiro details the experience himself. Fresh out of college, I had searched for a job that reflected my Save the World idealism, and found no better opportunity than that offered by the American Peace Corps to be a teacher in Nepal. My transition from student to teacher involved traveling to a society and a school that barely resembled those in which I grew up. I assumed that these schools and people desperately needed our help. Kumashiro explains how strange it was to adapt to the customs of the village where he lived and the school in which he taught, while everyone around him took it for granted as common sense. I tried to manage the classroom with dialogue and verbal admonitions, but was often told by students that controlling a classroom meant hitting those who misbehave. Some students even encouraged me to do so. Perhaps most significantly, I had wanted to introduce activities, materials, and problems that I had created on my own, but learned that lessons had always centered on official textbooks issued by the government. The schools in Nepal focused on very outdated methods of teaching, and Kumashiro had been brought in to promote different styles of teaching that might be more effective. In writing about this experience, Kumashiro reflects on how not only the Nepali system, but his role as a promoter of the American way of teaching is a good example of his philosophy of anti-oppressive education.
Two of Dr. Kumashiro's primary approaches for anti-oppression are education for the other and education about the other. To understand these techniques, first we must define oppression and otherness. Kumashiro says that oppression is any situation or dynamic in which certain identities or ways of being are privileged in society, while others are marginalized. He uses the term other to refer to groups traditionally marginalized in society, as in other than the norm. This includes students of color, from under or unemployed families, females, males who aren't stereotypically masculine, students with disabilities, with limited or no English language proficiency, from non-Christian religious backgrounds, and who are or are perceived to be queer. Kumashiro uses the term queer to refer to students who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersexed, meaning neither male nor female, or otherwise queer in their sexual identity or sexual orientation. Education for the other focuses on improving the experiences of othered students. This approach acknowledges that schools are spaces where the other is treated in harmful ways through both actions and inactions by their peers, teachers, administrators, and politicians. Kumashiro says the entire school needs to be a safe space where the other will not be harmed verbally, physically, institutionally, or culturally. It also needs to be an affirming space where otherness is embraced, normalcy is not assumed, and where othered students can have role models. Education for the other also includes providing separate spaces that are supportive, therapeutic, and empowering, where othered students can go for help, support, advocacy, and resources. The overarching idea of education for the other is that teachers shouldn't be colorblind. Rather, they must not only acknowledge diversity, but embrace the differences and treat their students as they are, raced, gendered, sexualized, and classed individuals, and employ pedagogies that do so. A strength of this approach is that it makes educators realize that when put together, minority groups actually make up the majority of their class, and that most of their students, namely any that are not white, American, male, hegemonically masculine, heterosexual, Christian, and middle class, are being marginalized. Education for the other makes teachers responsible for reaching all of their students. Kumashiro's approach doesn't come without weaknesses. Focusing on the negative experiences of the other may imply that the other is the problem. Providing specific spaces requires defining the other, despite the fluid, changing nature of identity. Having designated efforts for various identities may marginalize students who identify with more than one group. A female student may feel oppressed in a space for people of color, but may have sexist individuals. A person of color may feel unsafe in a space for LGBT students that may have racist individuals. Students won't find the gay liberation movement in their history textbooks. When others are absent from curricula, students only learn about otherness. This second approach urges teachers to include specific units on the other, such as a unit on influential women in science. Strengths of this approach include making teachers illuminate different ways of living, which fosters understanding among students, normalizes differences, increases knowledge about and empathy for the other, and reaches all students instead of specifically targeting the othered student. However, it too has its weaknesses. A unit on Asian people may unintentionally present a certain case as the Asian experience. It continues to create a divide between the norm and the other, and practically speaking, there's only so much time in the school year.
Kevin Kumashiro views education through 3 lenses, the first one being learning and unlearning, then teaching and unteaching, the last lens being an unrealized promise of education. Looking into the first lens, Kumashiro notes that students don't walk into a classroom with a blank mind. They have the schema that they know. This schema, whether it's right or wrong, is usually shaped by the common sense of the world. The purpose of education isn't to affirm or confirm what is already there. The purpose is to help students unlearn what is already there and question what is already there. Learning new information can challenge old information, which can make learning uncomfortable. Kumashiro challenges educators to go against the grain and challenge this new information.
For his perspective on English, Dr. Kumashiro really emphasizes his belief that there needs to be more ethnically diverse books students should read in school. The majority of books are based on white people, and with the lack of diversity, the students only have certain experiences and perspectives. With more diverse literature, students will expand their knowledge and perspective of other cultures besides their own. Many times, students don't see themselves in the text they read, therefore they are much less engaged and have a hard time connecting the text to their personal lives. Overall, literature that involves a multitude of cultures and races will really help the students engage and make it easier for them to connect and understand English in a whole new perspective.
Because the areas of math and science are seen as objective, justifiable subjects, some might think that there's no hidden oppression to be found within them. But Kumashiro believes that in itself is a commonsensical idea that must be challenged. For example, many ideas in science are based on theories which are framed on other theories or hypotheses, and not all groups agree on the same theories. For some, religion and scientific theories actively contradict each other, which can lead to teachers alienating their religious students unless they handle the subject with care. Math also hides oppressive education. Word problems often reinforce white privilege and traditional gender roles. Different methods of arithmetic or measurement developed by other cultures take backseat to traditional methods, leading students to believe the traditional way is the best or only way.
Kumashiro talks about the common sense of the world. Looking back 100 years ago, it used to be the common sense that women shouldn't get too much education. There was a science at the time stating that if women get too much education, they could go crazy and become infertile. Looking back 50 years ago, it used to be the common sense to not allow darker-skinned people to receive an education. There was a science at this time stating that people with darker skin are less able to learn, so why should we waste our resources? Looking at these old common senses, we can probably all agree that these are crazy. But at the time, they were the common sense. 50 years from now, when we look back on today, what is our common sense? Kumashiro wants educators to think about our common sense and to think about it critically. So, as an educator, I ask you this last question. What is something we see as common sense that the next generation will view as crazy?